My name is Xylos, and for the first 16 cycles of my life, I believed in monsters. Not the kind that lurked in the shadows of a child's mind, but the kind that stood in the shimmering light of the grand arena, their chitinous hides gleaming like polished obsidian. They were the Catharn, the undisputed masters of the galaxy, and we were their subjects. Not slaves in chains, but subjects in awe. We served them because to serve them was to be safe. To be safe meant to live, and to live was to witness their terrifying glory. I remember the cold air of my homeworld, Volta Prime. It wasn't the cold of winter. It was the cold of a world that knew its place. Our cities were built in the shadows of their colossal spires, structures that pierced the clouds and hummed with a power we could only dream of replicating. My father, a historian of sorts, used to whisper their history to me as a bedtime story. He spoke of their ancient conquests, how they had tamed the savage stars, their claws cutting through the void like a scythe through wheat. They were the apex predators of existence, the strongest warriors alive. The universe was their hunting ground, and we were the grateful beneficiaries of their mercy. There are things out there, Xylos, my father would say, his eyes looking past me, seeing the terrifying vastness of space. Things that make the Catharn look like the hatchlings you see in the nurseries, but none have ever stood against them. They are the shield. I believed him, we all did. It was the fundamental truth of our existence. The Catharn were the reason our sun still rose, the reason the asteroid belts didn't pulverize our cities, the reason the void spawn didn't crawl from the edges of the galaxy and devour us all. They were the masters of war, their very biology a weapon. Their claws could shear through starship hulls, their thick hides were impervious to plasma fire, and their minds were sharp, tactical, and utterly without mercy. The day of the grand exhibition was the most sacred day in the galactic cycle. The Catharn would display their might, reminding all subject species of their power. The arena, a colossal structure carved into the heart of a dormant volcano on the capital world of Cathar, would be filled with representatives from hundreds of worlds. My father, being a historian of some note, was given the honor of attending, and he brought me along. We walked through the gleaming, bone-white corridors of the arena. The air hummed with the low thrum of alien machinery, and the scent of ozone and something metallic like hot blood filled my nostrils. The air was too dry, too sterile. It made my skin feel tight. I was a Volturian, a species of humanoid descent with pale blue skin and wide, sensitive eyes that could see the faintest shift in light. The Catharn, for all their power, had a strange effect on my kind. Their presence made our skin prickle with a low-level static discharge, a constant reminder of the predator in our midst. I saw the delegates of the Zillanthrope insected beings who moved with a syncopated, chattering grace. I saw the massive, lumbering Gravians whose very presence seemed to bend the light around them, and I saw the Catharn guards. They stood like statues at every doorway. They were massive, 10 feet tall of raw muscle and chitin, their heads a nightmare of mandibles and multifaceted eyes that reflected our own fearful forms back at us. They didn't look at us. They simply were. They radiated an aura of absolute, unyielding power that made my very soul feel small. These were the monsters, the greatest warriors. We settled into our seats, high in the stands. The arena floor was a massive, gravitonically flattened expanse of dark, dense rock. It was a bowl of silence, waiting to be filled with destruction. The crowd was a soft murmur of 100 different languages, a prayer of whispers for the display to come. The air grew thick with anticipation. I gripped the cold metal railing, my knuckles turning a deeper shade of blue. My father put a calming hand on my shoulder, but I could feel the slight tremor in his own hand. Then the trumpets sounded, but they weren't the joyful sound of celebration. They were the deep, sonorous blare of a war horn, a sound that vibrated in your bones and made your teeth ache. 2 massive doors, each the size of a city block, groaned open on opposite ends of the arena. And the monsters emerged. From one side came the Catharn war captain. His name was Karnak, a legend even among his own kind. He was a titan of chitin and sinew, his carapace scarred with the white lines of 1,000 battles. He stood on two powerful legs, but his torso was hunched forward, his long arms ending in scythe-like claws that dragged on the ground, leaving grooves in the rock. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. From the other side emerged a Gravian pit fighter. It was a hulking, bipedal mountain of flesh, its skin the color of a dying star. Its massive arms were like tree trunks, and in each hand it carried a weapon that looked like a miniature sun, pulsing with raw energy. This was to be a display of pure, unadulterated power, a clash of titans. The battle was swift and brutal. The Gravian swung its sun weapon, sending arcs of searing plasma across the arena. The air itself screamed, but Karnak was faster. He seemed to flicker, his body becoming a blur of motion. He dodged the plasma arcs with an inhuman grace, his claws tracing trails of white-hot light in the air. He was a whirlwind of death. One moment he was 100 feet from the Gravian, the next he was on top of it. His claws moved in a flash. There was a screech of tearing flesh and a shower of sparks. The Gravian's sun weapon fell to the ground, its light sputtering out. Karnak had severed the Gravian's arms at the shoulder. The creature bellowed in pain, a sound that shook the very foundations of the arena. Karnak didn't pause. He was a machine. He leaped onto the Gravian's back, his claws finding purchase in its thick hide. In a final, brutal motion, he brought his mandibles down on the Gravian's neck. A sickening crunch echoed through the silent stadium. The Catharn had won. The arena erupted in a chaotic blend of terror and forced adulation. The other delegates cheered, not out of joy but out of fear. It was a desperate sound. I heard the Gravian delegates wail, a cacophony of grief. I saw Karnak stand over his vanquished foe, raising his blood-slicked claws to the sky. He let out a roar that was the sound of the void itself tearing apart. I was trembling. I had seen the Catharn fight before, but this was different. This was a demonstration of sheer, magnificent brutality. It was a lesson. We were not equals. We were not even prey. We were witnesses to their power. They were the strongest warriors alive. They were the monsters, and in our hearts we worshipped them for their terrifying strength. The feeling of dread of being so utterly insignificant settled into my very being. I looked at my father, his face ashen. He held my hand, his grip cold and clammy. We were safe, but we were small. The exhibition continued, a parade of violence that blurred together into a symphony of pain. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone, charred flesh, and the metallic tang of blood. It was a scent I would come to know all too well, a scent that had become the perfume of our corner of the galaxy. I was lost in my own thoughts in the terrible beauty of the destruction, when a strange, out-of-place sound cut through the chaos. It was a laugh, a bright, sharp sound that was completely at odds with the solemn, terrified atmosphere. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of pure, unadulterated excitement. I looked around, trying to find the source. My eyes scanned the rows of stoic, terrified faces. No one was laughing. Then I saw him, a figure a few rows down and across from us. He was standing, not sitting in respectful awe like the rest of us. He was leaning over the railing, his shoulders shaking. He was laughing. As I watched, he turned to his companion, another figure like him, and pointed at the blood-soaked arena floor. I couldn't hear what he was saying over the roar of the crowd, but his body language was unmistakable. It was a gesture of sheer, unadulterated fascination. Not fear, not horror, fascination. He was a human. Part 2, The Laughter in the Silence. Chapter 2, The First Crack. I'd never seen a human before, not in the flesh. They were a curiosity from the galactic records, a species from the far reaches of the spiral arm. They were known as fragile and unremarkable, their homeworld a low-gravity backwater with a corrosive atmosphere. They had no claws, no natural armor, no psionic abilities. They were soft, pinkish things with thin skin and flat, expressive faces. They were, by all accounts, a perfectly average species, notable only for their stubbornness and a tendency to, quite literally, blow themselves up. In the galactic order, they were considered a minor power at best, a nuisance at worst. They were the antithesis of a Catharn. Yet here was one, laughing at the most violent display of power I had ever witnessed. My father saw him too, his brow furrowed, a rare expression of confusion on his usually serene face. "What is he doing?" he murmured to himself, more than to me. The human was taller than me, but still far shorter than the Catharn. He wore simple, functional clothing, a dark, form-fitting jumpsuit that seemed to have no pockets or adornments. His hair was a strange, dark brown cropped close to his skull. From this distance I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I could sense the energy radiating from him. It was completely different from the mournful energy of the Gravians, the fearful energy of the Zillanthrope, or the reverent awe of my own people. This was an energy of pure, unadulterated interest. He leaned over to his companion, another human, this one with shorter, light-colored hair, and pointed to the intricate patterns of scars on Karnak's carapace. He gestured with his hands, mimicking the motion of the Catharn's claws. He was analyzing the fight. He was breaking it down like an engineer looking at a fascinating piece of machinery. The companion nodded, his own face a mask of intense concentration. There was no fear in his body language. No, not fear. Was it approval? It was a bizarre, discordant note in the symphony of terror. My mind, steeped in a lifetime of Catharn worship, struggled to process it. This being, this human, should be shivering. He should be bowing his head. He should be weeping at the sight of the Catharn's terrifying efficiency. He was doing none of those things. As the next display began, a Catharn hunt master hunting a pack of Vorten beasts across a simulated terrain, the human's behavior became even more peculiar. The hunt master was a blur of controlled fury, picking off the Vorten with surgical precision. It was a masterclass in hunting. The crowd gasped and murmured their awe. The two humans, however, leaned closer together, their heads almost touching. They were having a discussion, a private, whispered debate. The one with the dark hair, I would later learn his name was Eric, shook his head. He pointed to a specific maneuver the hunt master made, a move that involved a leap and a twist. He traced a path in the air with his finger. The other, whose name was Marcus, shook his head in return. He gestured to the hunt master's flank, then to his own midsection. They were pointing out a flaw, right in the middle of the arena, right in the middle of the Catharn's display of perfection. They were looking at a masterpiece of violence, the culmination of 1 billion years of evolution designed for the sole purpose of killing, and they were critiquing it. It was like watching a mouse trying to explain to a lion that it could have pounced better. It was absurd. It was almost blasphemous. The hunt master, having dispatched the last Vorten, stood on a rocky outcrop and let out a triumphant roar, baring rows of razor-sharp teeth. The crowd erupted in a forced, reverent cheer. The humans, however, were still whispering. Now it was the light-haired one, Marcus, who was doing the gesturing. He was pointing to a spot on the simulated terrain, a place where the shadows were particularly deep. He was talking rapidly, his hand movements sharp and precise. Eric nodded, his expression turning serious. They finally sat back in their seats, their whispering over. I saw the light-haired one look at Eric, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He was nodding. It was then that I realized I had been starring. The human with the dark hair, Eric, had turned and was looking directly at us. He looked at me, his eyes a bright, piercing blue. My heart froze. He was looking at me, a Volturian child, from a place of undeniable curiosity. He wasn't looking at me with the cold, predatory gaze of the Catharn. He was looking at me with the same fascinated expression he'd worn watching the hunt master. Then he did something that made the entire universe seem to tilt on its axis. He smiled. It was a small, quick smile, a flash of white teeth. Then he winked at me. He actually winked at me. I was so stunned that I didn't react. I just stared. The smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a focused look as he returned his attention to the arena. He had just, in a single gesture, shattered the solemnity of the entire event for me. He had laughed at the violence, critiqued the masters of it, and then acknowledged a scared child from a subject race as if we were equals sharing a private joke. The rest of the exhibition was a blur. I barely saw the gravity-defying acrobatics of the Catharn pilots or the devastating power of their warship displays. My mind was entirely on the two humans. I kept glancing back at them, trying to understand. Every time a Catharn did something impressive, they would exchange another glance. They weren't afraid. They were inspired. They were taking notes. They were a small, fragile species in a room full of monsters, but they didn't act like the prey. They acted like the predator in waiting. The exhibition finally ended with a deafening blast of the war horns. The massive doors on the arena floor began to close, and the Catharn elite filed out of their private viewing booths, their presence a palpable weight that seemed to suck the very air from the room. The crowd began to shuffle out, a river of submissive bodies heading for the exits. I was walking, my mind a fog of confusion, when I saw them again. The two humans were moving against the current, their heads together, navigating the crush of aliens with an ease that seemed almost unnatural. They were heading toward a side corridor, one that led to the more restricted areas of the arena. A Catharn guard, a massive hulk of chitin and malice, stood blocking the entrance to the corridor. He was easily twice their size, a living wall of deadly intent. My father was trying to pull me along, but I was rooted to the spot. I saw the humans approach the guard. The Catharn's mandibles clacked in what could only be a warning. I was waiting for them to turn away. I was waiting for them to cower, to show the fear that was the only rational response to such a terrifying presence. They didn't. Eric stopped a few feet from the guard, a safe distance. He didn't look up at the guard's face. Instead, he looked him up and down, his gaze analytical. He said something, his voice too low for me to hear. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. The Catharn guard shifted, his massive body rippling with annoyance. He took a threatening step forward, his claws scraping against the floor. It was the move of a predator asserting dominance. Any sane being would have backed down. Any being would have fled. The humans didn't even flinch. Eric's hand went to his belt, a slow, deliberate motion. My heart seized in my chest. I thought he was going to draw a weapon, a suicidal move that would end with him being torn to pieces. He pulled out a small, flat object, a datapad of some sort. He held it up to the guard. The guard, momentarily confused by the lack of a weapon, leaned in to look at the screen. I don't know what was on that datapad. A code, a symbol, a message. Whatever it was, its effect was immediate. The guard froze. The aggressive posture evaporated. The mandibles clicked once more, but this time it was a different sound. It was a sound of acknowledgement, perhaps even deference. The guard stood aside, his massive body pressing against the wall to make room. Eric and Marcus didn't look at him. They didn't offer thanks. They simply walked past him into the restricted corridor and disappeared from sight. The guard resumed his position, his multifaceted eyes staring straight ahead as if nothing had happened. I stood there frozen in the throng of departing delegates. My father's hand tightened on my shoulder. His face was pale. He had seen it too. The Catharn, the great, terrifying Catharn, had stepped aside for a human. He had moved his massive, deadly body out of the way, not out of fear of a weapon, but out of respect for a piece of plastic, a word. My father leaned down, his voice trembling. "Xylos," he whispered, his eyes wide and bewildered. The report about the human delegation's arrival was withheld from the public. But their ambassador, he requested to meet with the war captain. He was not afraid. He called Karnak a novice in the art of warfare. The world swam around me. The cold metal of the railing was gone. The smell of ozone and blood was gone. All that was left was the image of those two small, fragile beings walking past the monster. A monster who had just been called a novice by their kind. This was the first crack. A tiny fracture in the armor of my beliefs. The Catharn were not the only hunters in the galaxy, and I had just seen a glimpse of something that had the potential to be far more frightening. I had seen the true face of a human. Part 3, The Tapestry of Violence. Chapter 3, The Lesson of the Blade. Days turned into cycles. The grand exhibition faded into the background noise of galactic life. The Catharn were still the masters, their presence a constant, reassuring weight on our existence. My father, however, was a changed man. The incident with the humans and the guard had lit a fire in him, a flicker of curiosity that I had never seen before. He had started digging, pulling data from restricted archives, using his status as a historian to access information that most beings never saw. I would often find him in his study late into the night, surrounded by holographic displays of ship designs, battle tactics, and cultural records. He was obsessed, not with the Catharn but with the humans. "Look, Xylos," he would say, pulling up a grainy image of a human vessel. "It's crude, primitive by Catharn standards. No elegant curves, no organic design. It's all angles, boxes. They build their ships like they build their buildings. They're practical, functional, and look at the weapons." He would zoom in on the image, showing me the arrays of projectile launchers and energy cannons. The weapons didn't flow from the hull like the organic weapons of the Catharn. They were bolted on, retrofitted, and crammed into every available space. "It's the design philosophy of a being that has to make do," he'd explain, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. "A being that doesn't have the luxury of natural weapons. They have to improvise. They create their fangs, their armor, their claws from the rock and metal of their world. They are born weak, but they build their own strength." He began to collect stories, legends of human conflict. These were not the glorious, clean battles of the Catharn, where strength met strength and the victor was decided by sheer biological superiority. The human records were messy, full of cunning, deception, and most tellingly, a terrifying capacity for adaptation. He told me of the Battle of the Azure Nebula, where a small human fleet had been cornered by a Catharn squadron. By all accounts, they should have been annihilated. Instead, they retreated into the nebula, a place of dense, charged gas that interfered with the Catharn's advanced sensors. The Catharn, confident in their superiority, followed. They never came out. The humans, using cheap kinetic projectiles, slug throwers, my father had called them, had used the nebula's interference to get close and fire at point-blank range, their simple, primitive weapons punching through the Catharn's supposedly impenetrable chitin. "The Catharn were helpless," my father whispered, his eyes wide. "Their weapons, designed for long-range, clean engagements, were useless in the chaotic environment. The humans fought like cornered animals. They had no regard for the honor of a clean fight. They simply wanted to survive. And they did. They won." The story shook me. The Catharn didn't lose. They were the strongest. Yet my father was showing me proof that they had, in fact, been defeated. Not by a greater monster, but by a weaker one that refused to accept its own weakness. The news of the humans meeting with Karnak had officially been suppressed, but whispers started to spread. I heard a Zillanthrope trader whisper to a Gravian miner that the human ambassador had questioned a Catharn war captain's tactical decisions. It was a rumor, dismissed by most as utter nonsense. No one questions a Catharn. It's against the natural order of things. But I saw the look in my father's eyes when he heard the rumor. He didn't dismiss it. He saw the confirmation of his own research. The next time I saw the humans was a few cycles later, at the Hall of Records on Cathar. I was there with my father to study some ancient texts when we saw Eric and Marcus again. They were with a small delegation of their kind, moving through the hall with that same unnerving confidence. They stopped at a display of Catharn weaponry from their ancient wars. The display case contained a massive, curved blade, its edge so sharp it seemed to be smoking. It was a relic of a forgotten age. The humans crowded around it, their faces filled with wonder and that same analytical interest. One of them was wearing a strange, metallic arm brace that seemed to hum with energy. The human with the arm brace, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, leaned close to the display case. She wasn't looking at the blade's beauty, she was examining its composition, the way the metal was folded, the angle of its edge. She spoke to her companions and Eric nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. He then did something that made my blood run cold. He took out a small device and ran it over the glass of the display case. A scanning device. A Catharn archivist, a lesser-ranked creature with a smaller carapace, saw this and rushed over. I could tell from his posture that he was angry. Not just angry, but outraged. How dare these flesh bags, these soft, pink things, scan the sacred artifacts of the Catharn without permission? He began to gesture emphatically at the humans, his mandibles clicking in a frantic, angry rhythm. Eric didn't even look at him. He was too busy studying the data on his scanner. The other humans were, however. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between the archivist and Eric. He said something to the archivist, a single sentence, his voice calm and level. The archivist froze, his mandibles still. He looked from Marcus to Eric, then back to the display case. His anger seemed to drain out of him. He was being told something that had, quite simply, broken his processing. He stepped back, bowing his head in a gesture of subservience that I had only ever seen a Catharn receive, never give. The humans went back to their study, ignoring him. "What did he say?" I whispered to my father. My father was as pale as the marble floor. I can't hear them from here. The acoustics in this hall are terrible, but look at his face. He's not angry anymore. He's confused. He's scared." The Catharn archivist stood there for a moment, a pathetic figure. Then he scuttled away, his confidence shattered. A master of the galaxy had just been put in his place by a creature that shouldn't have had the authority to order a cup of tea. The idea was absurd, but it was happening right in front of me. After the humans left, my father and I approached the display case. The glass was clean, but there was a faint, residual energy signature from the scanner. My father hesitated, then ran his own hand over the glass. He was no scientist, but he knew enough. "They were analyzing the blade structure," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The molecular density, the crystalline alignment. They weren't admiring it, they were deconstructing it. They were trying to understand how it was made, how it could be broken." He turned to me, his eyes holding a profound, unsettling truth. "Xylos, they don't see the Catharn as gods. They see them as a mechanical problem to be solved. They are engineers of violence. The Catharn are the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Yes, they are. The humans aren't warriors. They're something else entirely. They're the ones who build the machines that kill the warriors." The Catharn's history was a tapestry of glorious individual conflict. Their power was measured in physical strength, in the sharpness of their claws, the density of their chitin. The human's history, as my father showed me, was a tapestry of collective ingenuity. Their power was not biological, it was technological, it was organizational, it was collaborative. Their strength did not come from any single warrior, but from a galaxy-spanning machine of logistics, science, and a unique, almost insane, capacity for working together under pressure. The Catharn had conquered the galaxy with their bodies. The humans were prepared to conquer it with their minds, and that, I was beginning to realize, was a far more terrifying prospect. The monsters were still the strongest warriors, but the humans were something worse. They were a force of nature, an idea that refused to die. Part 4, The Human Gambit. Chapter 4, The Ambassador's Game. My father's research, once a private obsession, began to take a dangerous turn. He became braver, more reckless. He would attend functions he was not invited to, seeking out the edges of human territory. He wasn't the only one. The whispers were growing louder. The rumors of the humans' audacity were spreading. Every subject species in the galaxy was talking about them in hushed, excited tones. Hope, a dangerous and forbidden emotion, was beginning to flicker in the hearts of the subjugated. The Catharn, sensing this shift, grew more aggressive. Their presence became heavier, more oppressive. They increased patrols, cracked down on communication, and the public executions became more frequent. It was a display of force meant to remind us all of our place. But it was a display born of fear. The masters were worried. The humans didn't seem to care. They continued to operate with an infuriating to the K-Tharn level of confidence. A human scientific expedition was permitted to land on K-Thar, a world off-limits to most other species. The official explanation was a cultural exchange, but everyone knew it was a farce. It was a reconnaissance mission. I was working in the capital's archival library one afternoon, helping my father with his research when the expedition arrived at our building. They were here like they had been at the Grand Arena to study. It was a small group, maybe 15 humans, and they were led by a tall, thin man with a stern face and eyes that missed nothing. This was the ambassador, Alexander Thorne, the one who had called Karnak a novice. I saw him from the mezzanine level as he entered the main hall. He was wearing a dark, formal uniform that was immaculate perfect. He walked with a purpose, his stride measured and authoritative. The K-Tharn librarians who greeted him were visibly nervous, their mandibles twitching. Thorne didn't even acknowledge their presence. He didn't see them as threats or obstacles. He saw them as furniture, data points. He immediately began issuing orders to his team in a calm, concise voice. They fanned out, moving to different sections of the library, their scanners already buzzing. One of them, a young woman, was assigned to the historical archives where my father and I were working. My father saw her coming and visibly stiffened. He had been researching human battle tactics, his workstation a chaotic mess of holographic displays. He tried to hide them, but it was too late. The human woman walked up to him, her eyes scanning his work with a clinical precision. She had the same look as Eric and Marcus. She wasn't curious, she was analyzing. "Interesting," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made the air feel thick. "A Voltorian historian focusing on human military history. You are a rare specimen, sir." My father stammered, his pale blue skin flushing a deep purple. I am just a scholar. The K-Tharns, their battles are." The woman didn't wait for him to finish. "The K-Tharns' battles are predictable, a contest of strength. We looked at their records, it's all the same. The bigger warrior wins, the bolder tactic succeeds, there is no subtlety." She gestured to his displays. "But our history, it is chaos. We fight wars we can't possibly win, and we find a way to win them anyway. We make our own luck, our own rules." She tapped a screen, pulling up a specific battle she had found in the archives. It was the Battle of the Azure Nebula. "This is a perfect example. The K-Tharn sent a squadron to destroy a human fleet. It should have been a massacre. Instead, the fleet lured them into a nebula filled with ionized gas. The K-Tharn sensors were useless. Their weapons were useless. They were blind. The humans, using their own kinetic weapons, destroyed them." She looked at my father, her eyes boring into his. "Tell me, historian, what is the definition of a stronger warrior?" My father was frozen. I could see his mind working, but the question was too complex, too dangerous. He didn't have an answer. The woman smiled, a cold, predatory smile that was far more frightening than any K-Tharn roar. "It is not the one with the sharpest claws or the thickest skin. It is the one who can change the nature of the battlefield. It is the one who can turn the enemy's strength into a weakness. That is the human way." She moved on to the next workstation, leaving my father shell-shocked. He stared at the holographic display of the human fleet, a collection of crude, boxy ships that had outsmarted the K-Tharn. He was seeing them, not as survivors, but as architects of chaos. I went back to my own work, my hands trembling. The interaction had been quick, almost casual, but its implications were terrifying. The human woman had just taught my father, a seasoned historian, a lesson. She had opened his eyes to a fundamental truth. The K-Tharn were strong. The humans were dangerous. Later that day, I saw Ambassador Thorne himself. He was standing in the center of the main hall, surrounded by a group of K-Tharn officials. They were all taller than him, their chitinous forms dwarfing his fragile frame. But Thorne was the one who commanded the space. He was the center of gravity. He was calm, collected, and he was being relentlessly polite. One of the K-Tharn officials, a high-ranking war captain, was lecturing him about the history of the K-Tharn. He was droning on about their great victories, their conquests, their unwavering dominance. Thorn listened, his face impassive, his hands clasped behind his back. When the Catharn finally finished, Thorn inclined his head. "Fascinating," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "But you speak only of your victories. Our records show you have also suffered defeats. Several, in fact, small ones perhaps, but defeats nonetheless." The war captain bristled, his claws scraping against the floor. "Impossible. No one defeats the Catharn." "No one defeats the Catharn in a fair fight," Thorn corrected, his tone still infuriatingly polite. "But the galaxy is not a fair place, is it, Captain? There are tactics, strategies, and the simple application of superior knowledge. You are a warrior species, the best there is, but humanity," he paused, letting the silence stretch. "Humanity is a species of scholars and engineers. We study things, we learn them, and then we find ways around them." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried clearly in the silent hall. "Tell me, Captain, what happens when the rules of the game change? You are the greatest warriors in existence, but your strength is defined by a very specific set of rules. What happens when those rules no longer apply?" The war captain was speechless. His mandibles clicked in frustration, but no words came. Thorn smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had just verbally disarmed a Catharn war captain in front of his own colleagues. He had exposed a fundamental flaw in their entire system of power. The Catharn were creatures of certainty. They operated in a world of defined physical laws. The humans operated in a world of possibilities. A low murmur rippled through the assembled aliens. The Zillanthrope, the Gravians, the Voltorians, we all saw it. We saw the master of the galaxy rendered impotent by a few well-chosen words. It wasn't a physical victory. It was an intellectual one, and it was far more devastating. The Catharn's power rested on the fear they inspired. The human had just shown that fear could be rendered obsolete by something far more powerful, understanding. They weren't just talking about building a better weapon. They were talking about building a better paradigm. They were the ultimate predators because they could evolve in a single generation, changing their tactics, their technology, and even their fundamental beliefs to suit the situation. The Catharn could not. I finally understood the laughter in the arena. Eric hadn't been laughing at the Catharn's savagery. He had been laughing at its predictability. He had seen the same show 1,000 times before in the archives of his own species. The Catharn were magnificent warriors, but they were also magnificent fossils. The humans were the future. I looked at the face of Ambassador Thorn. He was still standing there, his posture relaxed, a small, enigmatic smile on his lips. He was a human, fragile and small, but he had just done what no other being had ever done. He had made a Catharn war captain look small. Part 5, The Reckoning. Chapter 5, The World Fractures. The whispers stopped. The conversations, both public and private, about the humans just stopped. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic silence, but a creeping, deliberate hush. The Catharn had had enough. The rumors of the humans' diplomatic victories and their quiet, unnerving confidence had spread too far. The Catharn, for the first time in living memory, had been publicly embarrassed. The archivist, the war captain, the quiet disregard for their authority, it was an accumulation of slights that could no longer be ignored. A reckoning was coming. My father knew it before anyone else. He had become a nervous wreck, his research a frantic, desperate attempt to understand the looming conflict. He spent his days in the archives, his nights in a state of terrified vigilance. He would wake from nightmares, his hands shaking, whispering about human ships and Catharn claws. His obsession, once a source of wonder, had become a cage. "Xylos," he said one night, his voice a dry rasp. "It's happening. The Council of War Captains has been convened. It's a formality. They'll issue a formal challenge. They'll demand a public duel between the human ambassador and one of their champions. It's their way." "A duel?" I asked, my young voice trembling. "But the ambassador isn't a warrior. He wouldn't stand a chance." Exactly, my father said, his eyes wide and feverish. It's a trap. It's a way to save face. If he refuses, they'll brand him a coward. If he accepts, he'll be killed. Either way, their dominance is reasserted. The fools think they are executing a strategic move. They don't understand that they are walking into the humans' game. Catharn sent their formal challenge to the human delegation. It was a public spectacle broadcast across the galaxy. A Catharn war captain, a towering brute named Zorak, stood in the center of the grand arena, the same blood-soaked pit where I had seen Karnak crush the Gravian. He declared that the human ambassador had insulted the honor of the Catharn, and the only way to restore it was in the ancient tradition of single combat. The arena was open. The challenge was issued. The galaxy watched. The human response was swift and, to the shock of everyone, immediate. Ambassador Thorn appeared on the public broadcast, his face calm, his voice level. "The challenge is accepted," he said. "The humans will fight, but the Catharn must agree to our terms. The fight will not be a simple brawl. It will be a tactical engagement. Each warrior will be given one standard orbital platform's worth of tactical data and be allowed a support crew of 5 to formulate their strategy. The fight will be monitored by impartial observers from neutral species, who will ensure that no outside interference occurs." The galaxy went silent. His counter-proposal was insane. A tactical engagement, a support crew. It was the Catharn who were the masters of war. To the rest of the galaxy, this was not bravery, it was the height of foolishness. They were demanding to change the rules of a fight that they were already doomed to lose. It was suicide. The Catharn, overjoyed by what they saw as the humans' eager consent to their own execution, quickly agreed. They were so confident in their physical superiority that they couldn't conceive of a scenario where they could lose. To them, Thorn's proposal was the pathetic flailing of a creature that knew it was about to die. The day of the duel arrived. The grand arena was packed, not with the usual reverent crowd, but with a sea of tense, hopeful faces. The air was thick with a new kind of energy, the energy of a rebellion waiting for a spark. The Catharn were present, of course, their military might on full display, a clear warning to any who might dare to cheer for the wrong side. But the subtle buzz of excitement was undeniable. The humans had given the galaxy something it had never had before, a chance, a hope. The Catharn champion, Zorak, entered the arena first. He was a nightmare made flesh, even more terrifying than Karnak. He was armored in a thick bioengineered shell that seemed to glow with a faint inner light. He carried no weapons, for his body was a weapon. His claws were retracted, but I could see the muscles in his arms twitching, ready to deploy them at a moment's notice. He stood in the center of the arena, his multifaceted eyes scanning the crowd, a predator surveying its prey. Then the human champion entered. He was not a hulking brute. He was a slender, athletic figure in a form-fitting black combat suit. He was named Jackson, and his face was the picture of calm focus. He looked like a technician on his way to a job, not a warrior on his way to a fight. In his hands he carried a small, sleek black object. I initially thought it was a baton, a ceremonial weapon. It looked so insignificant compared to Zorak's natural weaponry. The duel began. Zorak didn't wait. He charged, a blur of speed and fury. His claws extended, razor-sharp and gleaming, aimed directly at Jackson's head. It was a kill strike, a move so fast that my eyes could barely track it. Jackson didn't try to dodge. He didn't retreat. He stood his ground, a small, fragile figure against a tide of destruction. At the last possible moment, he raised his weapon. It wasn't a baton. It was a small, black rod, which I later learned was a portable scanning device that he had modified. A pulse of white-blue light emanated from the rod, not aimed at Zorak, but at the floor directly in front of him. The ground shimmered for a fraction of a second, and a microgravity well, a localized singularity, appeared. It was a small, invisible tear in the fabric of space itself. Zorak's momentum carried him directly into the singularity. He didn't hit it, he was pulled into it. His massive, armored body was compressed, twisted, and stretched by the immense gravity. His claws scrabbled at the air, his roar of fury turning into a shriek of pure, unadulterated agony. The sound was horrific, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The singularity collapsed a split second later, releasing Zorak. He was thrown back, his armored body crumpled, his chitin cracked and smoking. He lay on the ground, twitching, his mighty form a broken ruin. He was still alive, but he was utterly defeated. The arena was silent. No one could process what they had just seen. The champion of the Catharn, the ultimate warrior, had been neutralized in a single, contemptuous move. He hadn't been beaten in a fight. He had been rendered obsolete by a piece of technology. It was like watching a dinosaur be brought down by a virus. Jackson didn't even look at the fallen warrior. He calmly turned his back on him and faced the Catharn delegation, who were watching from their private viewing booth. He held up his modified scanner for them to see. "A tactical engagement," he said, his voice amplified by the arena's speakers, echoing in the profound silence. "Your champion's armor, strong as it is susceptible to localized gravitational distortions. It was in his tactical data. You had the same data he did. You just didn't know how to use it." He walked out of the arena, his shoulders back, his head held high. The Catharn guards who had been ready to attack stood frozen. They were utterly lost. Their entire system of belief, their entire justification for their dominance had just been shattered in front of the entire galaxy. They were the strongest warriors, but they had been defeated by a piece of tech and a better understanding of physics. The silence of the crowd broke. It started as a low murmur, a wave of disbelief that quickly turned into something else, a cheer, a roar of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the sound of a galaxy being freed from 1,000 years of fear. The Gravians, the Zillanthrope, the Voltorians, all of them were screaming, crying, laughing. We had seen the impossible. We had seen a monster fall. My father was weeping, his hands clutching the railing. He turned to me, his face a mess of tears and joy. "Xylos," he shouted over the roar. You see what I was trying to tell you. They are not warriors. They are the end of warriors. They are the death of the old world." I looked out at the field, at the broken form of Zorak, and I finally understood. The Catharn were the strongest warriors alive, but humanity had just proven that being a warrior was no longer enough. The universe was changing, and the future belonged to those who could change with it. Part 6, A New Dawn. Chapter 6, The Weight of Understanding. The Catharn were broken, not physically, not yet, but their spirit, their aura of invincibility was shattered. The duel of Zorak had been broadcast across the galaxy. Every being, from the highest Gravian lord to the lowest Voltorian laborer, had seen it. They had seen a fragile human, armed with nothing but a small, unassuming device and a superior understanding of physics, completely and utterly destroy the Catharn champion. The old order was gone. The Catharn's reign, built on fear and awe, had been shown to be a house of cards, dependent on their subjects never questioning their power. But now, the galaxy had seen the flaw. They had seen that the Catharn were not gods, but simply highly evolved organisms that could be outsmarted. The subject species began to stir. The Gravians, who had been so brutally humiliated at the Grand Exhibition, were the first to openly rebel. They broke their chains and seized control of their own mining facilities, backed by the implicit threat of human intervention. The Zillanthrope, the insectoid race who had always been so compliant, began to form their own defense forces. The Voltorians, my own people, took to the streets. We were done being silent. But the humans, the architects of this revolution, didn't immediately step in to take control. They didn't invade the Catharn homeworlds, nor did they demand subservience from the other species. They simply waited. It was the most terrifying thing of all. They had the power to dominate, but they were choosing not to. They were observing, analyzing, letting the old system crumble under its own weight. I saw them again, a cycle after the duel. It was a quiet evening on my homeworld. My father and I were sitting on the porch of our small home, looking out at the twin moons of Voltor Prime. The air was cool and clean for the first time in my memory. The oppressive presence of the Catharn had lifted. We were free. Two figures were walking up the path to our house. They were human. I recognized one of them immediately. It was Eric, the man who had winked at me in the arena. The other was the woman who had spoken to my father in the library. Their presence sent a ripple of tension through me. Even now, I couldn't shake my deep-seated awe of them. They walked up to us, their faces unreadable. My father stood, his body tense. Eric held up a hand in a peaceful gesture. "Please," he said, "don't be alarmed. We are just here to talk." I was terrified, but the woman's eyes were kind. They were not the cold, analytical eyes I had seen before. They were curious, inquisitive. She was looking at us, not as specimens to be studied, but as individuals. "Your research was invaluable," the woman said to my father. "You were one of the first to understand the nature of our approach. It helped us refine our strategy. You should be proud." My father was speechless. He had been hiding his research, fearing persecution. And now the humans were thanking him. He stammered a response, but Eric was looking at me. "I remember you," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "The young Voltorian who was so confused by my laughter." I felt a flush of embarrassment. I didn't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were insane." Eric laughed, a sound that was much more genuine than the laugh I had heard in the arena. "You weren't the only one, but now you understand, don't you?" I nodded, my mind racing. "You weren't laughing at the violence. You were laughing at its predictability. You saw it as a puzzle." "Exactly," he said, his face softening. "The Catharn were formidable. They were the greatest warriors the galaxy had ever seen. But they were warriors. Their entire world was defined by physical conflict. They couldn't see the other battles. The battles of ideas, of technology, of strategy. They were masters of an old, dying art." He looked out at the moons, his expression thoughtful. "We aren't warriors, Xylos. We are survivors. We have no claws, no fangs, no armored hides. We are soft, pink, and fragile, so we had to get smart. We had to find other ways. We turned the universe itself into our tool. Physics, chemistry, psychology, mathematics, these are our weapons. We don't fight the enemy. We change the environment he fights in until he can no longer fight. It's not a way to win a battle. It's a way to make the battle itself irrelevant." The woman, whose name I learned was Anna, spoke up. "You saw the duel. A Gravian would have tried to match Zorak's strength. A Catharn would have tried to overwhelm him with speed. What did we do? We brought a graviton generator. We didn't try to be stronger, we made him weaker. We changed the rules of the fight. That's the human way. We are engineers of conflict." She looked at my father and me, her gaze soft, compassionate. "The Catharn were terrifying because they were strong. We are terrifying because we are adaptable. We can learn from anything. We can build anything. And if we must, we can destroy anything too. But we don't want to. We just want to be left alone to live our lives and improve our little piece of the universe." She paused, her gaze meeting mine. "Don't fear us, Xylos. We are not your masters. We are not your gods. We are just people like you. We have our own fears, our own challenges, our own battles to fight. We're not perfect. We've made terrible mistakes, but we are willing to learn from them. That is our greatest weapon and also our greatest weakness." They stayed for a little while, answering my father's endless questions. They talked about their homeworld, Earth, a blue and green jewel they called a mudball. They talked about their history, a story of constant war, innovation, and an unshakable belief in the potential of their species. They were not arrogant, they were humble. They were not cruel, they were surprisingly gentle. As they left, Eric put a hand on my shoulder. "You have a good mind, Xylos. You ask the right questions, don't let fear control you. The Catharn were the strongest warriors alive, but strength is not the only measure of a species. It's not even the most important one. Remember that." They walked away, their figures growing smaller in the twilight. My father and I stood there silent. The weight of the day's events was immense. The old world was dying. A new one was being born, and it was being born in the image of humanity. Not the image of a conqueror, but of an adaptable, tenacious, and relentlessly creative species that had refused to accept its own weakness, and had, in doing so, become the most powerful force in the galaxy. I looked up at the moons, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see them as silent, distant guardians. I saw them as possibilities. The Catharn had taught me to fear the universe. The humans had taught me to understand it. Ending line. I thought the monsters were the strongest warriors alive. Then I met the humans, and I understood that true strength is not in the power of your claws, but in the power of your mind to change the world around you. They were soft and fragile, and they had won the galaxy by refusing to be weak. They had shown us a new kind of warrior, one who didn't fight with brawn, but with the indomitable, unbreakable will of a species that could not, be defined by its limitations. This response is AI generated, for reference only.